This podcast episode was made possible in part with support from Sacred Rights, a project funded by the Henry Luce Foundation and the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation and hosted by Northeastern University. Sacred Rights is a project that supports public scholarship on religion and provides resources and networks for scholars of religion committed to translating the significance of their research to a broader audience. I recommend you learn more about Sacred Rights on their website at sacred-rights.org or find Sacred Rights on Twitter at sacred_rights. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. Since 2017, I have talked to professors, authors, teachers, journalists, practitioners, and scholars about all things related to religion. On this episode, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Chauncey Diego Francisco Handy. Dr. Chauncey Handy is Assistant Professor of Religion at Reed College. As a Chicano scholar of the Hebrew Bible, Chauncey's work focuses on the intersection of race and racialization, theories of ethnicity, Latinx theorization of identity, and the reception history of the Hebrew Bible. He earned his Ph.D. from Princeton Theological Seminary and is working on turning his dissertation, Mestizo Poetics of Belonging, Deuteronomy's Construction of Israelite Ethnicity, into a published book. In this project, he considers the nature of ethnicity as presented in the text of Deuteronomy through the lens of Gloria Anzaldúa's articulation of mestizaje. Please enjoy our conversation. Dr. Chauncey Handy, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here.
I'm delighted that you're here as well. I'm wondering if we can kick this off by having you introduce yourself a little bit to the audience, however you see fit.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think it helps to start with my full name because Chauncey Handy doesn't necessarily tell people a lot. My full name is Chauncey Diego Francisco Handy. It's a interesting heritage story, but I'm a Chicano scholar of the Pentateuch. And I say it that way because Chicano for me is both recognition of heritage, a complicated heritage, and a sense of placing my social location first and foremost in the work.
Yeah.
So I think and write and research through the knowledges and practices of my community and Latinx communities broadly speaking as well, but try to be as particular as possible in the sense of relying on Chicanx ways of thinking and being to approach the Pentateuch. And I say Pentateuch and rather than the Hebrew Bible, I could say Hebrew Bible. But I think Pentateuch is just much more specific because when I was deciding what I wanted to do, I wanted to be academically and personally committed to a shared text between Judaism and Christianity. Jews read the Torah every year all the way through, and Christians read parts of it at least during the year. So that's kind of how I talk about myself as a Chicano scholar of the Pentateuch. I'm from Bellingham, Washington, here in the Great Pacific Northwest. Grew up here. Spent 11 years in graduate school. I went to Duke Divinity School, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Princeton Theological Seminary, and then I started a job at Reed shortly after finishing my dissertation. And they have just offered me, and I've accepted a tenure track position here. So I am now assistant professor of religion and humanities.
Amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you.
What
exciting.
Amazing timing. I'm so delighted that I get the chance to tell you that right when it's fresh news. That's awesome.
I just signed the contract this morning. So you're one of the first.
Wow. Okay. Well, what an amazing moment we are documenting here on the Classical Ideas podcast. We are breaking news here. This is fantastic. You
heard it here first.
I would love to know a little bit more about your personal background. I mean, if you wouldn't mind sharing, I'm curious because you contextualize yourself so specifically. I would just love to know a little bit more about like any family, history, anything that matters to you. I'd love to hear some of that.
No, I'd be pleased to share. I mean, it's important to contextualize these things. I think biblical studies in general tends to steer, not everyone, but many steer away from these sorts of conversations. As you can tell, I do the opposite. So I think talking about it is merited. So my dad's side of the family, my family there is from South Texas, the Rio Grande Valley. the border crossed us after the Mexican-American War. Over time, family has spread out, and my dad moved to Washington State, met my mom. Here I am. But in the process, my dad being Roman Catholic and my mom being Presbyterian of sorts, decided to put me in an evangelical Lutheran Church of America congregation to try to balance it out. My dad could recognize the liturgy, my mom could have communion too, and
Mm-hmm.
it was so it was there that I started to experience these biblical texts in these Lutheran settings where people take biblical texts seriously, but not in a kind of fundamentalist approach. And I found myself as a really curious kid, a
Mm-hmm.
really curious brown kid in a in a
Mm-hmm.
predominantly white congregation, asking questions about, could you tell me more biblical stories, please? It just really catalyzed my imagination. And there was this moment where I was asking my Sunday school teacher, can we read more? And they said, no, color your King David, please.
Mm-hmm.
And and there's something about that moment, rather than saying like, I'll never ask questions again, I pivoted to be the sort of person who asks questions for a living. And
Mm-hmm.
so in a certain sense, I mean, that moment is, I still think about that moment as a formative experience, not necessarily I've got you now, but to try and make space for my own curiosity with regard to these texts that communities of faith live with, that I've experienced my entire life and in various contexts. And so this is, a significant part of why I do the work, is just to give a thinking person's approach to these texts that people often, want to treat in some kind of uncritical fashion.
Gotcha. Is that the origin too of your interest in the Pentateuch and the Hebrew Bible as kind of like the kicking off point?
I think honestly, the origin of the Pentateuch Hebrew Bible was when I took biblical Hebrew. I took biblical Hebrew in my second year at Duke Divinity School, and I had a fantastic teacher. He teaches at Pitt. His name is Ben Gordon. Ben lived in the state of Israel for a number of years, was conversant with rabbinic interpretation, rabbinic Hebrew, modern Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, spectacular educator, and really opened this world to me of Jewish perspectives on texts. And to that point, I'd practically not heard much. And so to suddenly have this moment of realization, which I feel very embarrassed about, but it's the story, that another religious community had had our texts for longer than
Mm.
we did. I found myself very embarrassed by this, and realized that I needed to know more about this. I needed to know what was going on, because this is a fundamentally problematic lack of knowledge. And
Mm-hmm.
so I went into Ellen Davis's office at Duke Divinity School, and I said, what should I do about this? And she said, well, you'll need to go get a PhD, and you'll probably need to move to Israel to get your Hebrew better. And I said, move to Israel? And she said, yes, Chauncey, this is the rest of your life. It's
Yeah.
important to get it right.
Yeah.
And so I followed her advice. Anyway, and all that is to say, in the process, I realized for me, the work couldn't be done with integrity, leaving Jews, Judaism, Jewish communities to one side.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that sense, I kind of knew at that moment that it was going to be the Torah, it was going to be the Pentateuch, it was going to be these five texts that were going to be the primary focus of my work, because it kept me anchored in Jewish streams of thought. And along the way, a lot of my education was with Jewish educators
Mm-hmm.
who dramatically and very evidently for the better, in my opinion, shaped the way I think and the way my work takes place, in a way that you can see. My students here at Reed are all kind of giving me these, like, "Are you Jewish?" I'm like, "No, I'm not," but I've spent a long time with the communities, and it's definitely shaped how I do my work.
Interesting. Okay. So I want to know about your dissertation a little bit too. So you have this
Yeah.
dissertation, Mestizo Poetics of Belonging,
Hmm.
Deuteronomy's Construction of Israelite Ethnicity. So
Yeah.
tell me a little bit about nailing down this dissertation topic when you were doing your PhD at Princeton.
Absolutely. So when I started my PhD at Princeton, I was coming out of a 2-year MA at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So I lived in the state of Israel, and in the West Bank for about 2 years. And one of the things that I noticed there was the nature of biblical texts functioning to, in some sense, support or contradict or challenge these kind of ethnic conflicts. In particular, I was rooming with Christian Zionists who made a number of very bold claims about what the book of Joshua facilitates.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that there was something there for me. Like I wanted to understand what it is that the Bible did, historically speaking, to shape the way people thought about themselves. And then what is it doing now? How is it helping, or, for better or for worse, helping communities establish senses of belonging and exclusion? How does it justify certain ways of being versus others? And so when I got to Princeton Theological Seminary, I took a class with Brian Rainey, who teaches at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta. At the time, he was a professor at Princeton Seminary, and I took this class, this independent study on ethnicity with him, and it just kind of sparked this imagination. And I saw that was the big thing I wanted to talk about. I wanted to engage with Israelite ethnicity, in part for autobiographical reasons, because my own heritage, my mother is Scots Irish Presbyterian, my dad's Mexican American Roman Catholic,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm who I am. And so
Mm-hmm.
this project gave me space to sort through some of those issues for myself personally, while directing it towards a project that I thought would contribute something substantive to both my field and the research that I wanted to do. So in some sense, I took those ideas were there, and then I took a class on biblical law with Dennis Olson at Princeton Seminary, and I realized that the Edomites showed up in two places in Deuteronomy, and only two places, and the portrayal of them was different. And then I looked harder, and I saw that it wasn't just the Edomites; it was the Edomites, the Moabites, and the Ammonites both showed up in these different places, and their portrayals were different. And so I was like, okay, well, this is really interesting. I want to know more about this. Why would someone, in theory, put these two different articulations of the sense of belonging? Because as opposed to the Canaanites today, who I think are a mythic projection of kind of otherness that has to do with intra-Israelite debate, the Edomites, the Adamites, and Moabites were extant peoples. These are people who actually ancient Israelites saw and spoke to in some sense, intermarried with, at least in terms of the archaeological data that we have. And so I suddenly saw this as the perfect opportunity to put my big questions into play in a very specific, textually oriented way that would help us conceptualize a lot of things that were going on. And in the process, I realized that a lot of the tools that had been deployed for biblical studies tended to be coming from these European, Euro-American ways of understanding belonging. In some sense, that these kind of monolithic, static categories, and not quite this way, but tending towards a lack of ability to conceptualize the messiness of being between things.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was asking friends, where would you start to kind of conceptualize this? And they said, well, you should really read Gloria Anzaldúa. And I read Gloria Anzaldúa's the new Mestiza, her Borderlands book, and I mean, it just kind of opened all these horizons for me. And interestingly enough, she was born in the same county as my dad in Texas.
Nice.
Which was a very small world. So anyway, putting all these pieces together, Gloria Anzaldúa's work really allowed me to conceptualize the way ancient Israel, in some sense, in the text of Deuteronomy, thinks about itself, that there are these opposing deployments of traditions that are not in Deuteronomy. So for instance, in Deuteronomy 2, the Edomites are portrayed very positively, the Ammonites and the Moabites as well. Everyone's very friendly to Israel coming out of the desert. Well, in Numbers, Edom, Ammon, and Moab, Edom and Moab anyway, are very hostile to Israel. So there's this reinterpretation. And then by the time you get to chapter 23, this legal passage referring to who can participate in this kind of inner sanctum of sorts of Israelite religion, the Edomites are allowed in. They can over 3 generations, they're full members of the community, no problem there. The Moabites and the Ammonites, on the other hand, are totally rejected, like in a permanent, no one ever related to them can ever come into this space. And that is talking that tradition is channeling the version from Numbers. So not the version from earlier in Deuteronomy. So you've got these two kind of imaginations around the way ancient Israel relates to its neighboring communities, and they don't square. And so I was really struck by this. And Anzaldúa's work points to the fact that you just don't have to square these things. That you have to, that she has this word called that she takes from Nahuatl, which is like the language the Aztecs or the Mexica spoke, and still spoken today for the record. But she uses this word napantla, which is like an in-between liminal space to describe what's going on there with this word called mestizaje, this sense that you're between two things. Mestizaje is this like Spanish colonial construct word implying racial ethnic intermixture, and it has its own colonial problems, which have to do with anti-indigeneity, but all of these things map onto Deuteronomy. I mean, it's shocking when you try to play out the ways in which, how would you as an ancient Israelite fulfill the covenant in Deuteronomy's eyes in this mixed setting. You're going to be in a point of tension because it's not really clear what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to think about the Moabites and the Ammonites in particular.
Well, and I'm thinking too about in the title of your piece, it's construction of Israelite ethnicity. And then bringing in the mestizo aspect of it and seeing the ways that, cultures are constructed essentially is a really fascinating connection to make as well, because it connects it a lot to modern conversations. It doesn't relegate it to the, distant past, thousands of years ago, whenever biblical stories are taking place. It really kind of puts it here and now in front of our eyes, doesn't it?
Yeah. And I think that this is a really important thing to talk about in the context of my dissertation. I had a really good question from one of my committee members, and it was not a rhetorical question. I mean, he knew the answer, but he wanted me to say it, which I guess it didn't feel like a rhetorical question anyway. It could have been. But he said, well, why are you using these contemporary theorists to talk about antiquity? You should spell that out. And the answer to that is, of course, living on the borders of empire, as ancient Israel did, as Chicanos in the South United States do along the border, like those dynamics are very similar.
Yeah.
Modern empires, ancient empires, I mean, they're all kind of a giant protection racket. Nothing's terribly new in that sense. And so the dynamics of what happens to marginalized communities in these interstitial spaces are not one-to-one, but quite stable in some sense. And I think realizing and remembering, as often people don't necessarily do, that ancient Israelite literature developed kind of under the boot of empire, of various empires. And so to remind ourselves and biblical scholars in general that we have better access to these texts from the voices of marginalized communities. It just actually tells us more of what's going on historically speaking, because the kind of prevailing methodologies that come out of the origins of biblical studies as a discipline tend to do with European colonialism. And so, in what ways can the colonizer understand the colonized, or in what ways can the colonized actually help us think about what ancient colonized literature is doing?
So I know you're adapting this for a book too, and people obviously can read this dissertation if they're like academically inclined, but then whenever you put it into book form, it kind of makes it a little more accessible to the broader world a bit. How's the adaptation process going for the book?
It's good. I mean, there are pieces that need to be left on the cutting room floor. So I have a whole chapter in the dissertation on redaction criticism. How did Deuteronomy form the way it is now? And realistically, that'll be much abbreviated in perhaps the introduction at most, if not just entirely gone. I was talking to Joel Baden at Yale, and I was like, yeah, so I wrote all this and I realized I didn't really need it. And he was like, I would believe you if you're talking about Deuteronomy in the 4th or 5th century as a whole. Like, that's fine. And I was like, well, if Joel Baden likes it, then a lot of other people will too in this sense. So, I think, because he's a great scholar and a part of these debates, as are many others. But, for him to say, yeah, you don't need to do the redaction work there in some sense and to have that echoed from others who are methodologically different in their approach to the Pentateuch, I was like, okay, well.
Yeah, we'll just file that section in your folder, because there's an article right there for you.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a really good point.
Mean? Just use the redaction stuff as a full standalone article, and then just mention it in the book, but then you can expand upon it in a full length article. I think that you've got something there.
Well, I really appreciate it. I mean, but that's the main part that's going to be left on the cut. Other things will need to be abbreviated, but that's the part that likely won't make the cut. But it'll make the cut for other things, as you've said.
Love it. Well, let's talk about an article that you do have out. It's called
Yeah, yeah.
Reading with Canaanite Eyes, Joshua 5 and the Gaze of the Indigenous Mexican Revolutionary. What is this article about?
The article is about the way we deal with these violent texts.
Mm,
In a lot of, so my education took place with a lot of Brevard child students who used to teach at Yale for a number of years, and kind of the father of what's called canonical criticism. So we read the text in the order that the church has received it, and in so doing, we're able to understand particular things about what's going on. And he was very nuanced in this, but I think a lot of people following his footsteps, not his students, but people several generations away, have failed to really appreciate the inherent violent possibilities of the texts that we live with. Like the book of Joshua, just there's no, as far as I'm concerned, there are there's no positive plain sense reading of this text. There's not a way to read the book of Joshua in terms of the words on the page, in terms of either like literary approaches, deep reading, syntax, close readings, what have you. You can't save it from itself. So what I'm hoping to do is make a rationale for what ought we do with these texts. So I turned to Robert Warrier's work. He's a scholar in Kansas, member of the Osage Nation, wrote a book. No, it was an article called "Cowboys, Canaanites, and Indians," where he argues that one needs to read biblical text through the perspective of indigenous communities to understand the violent possibilities of these texts. So, in some sense, he comes out to say, well, like, look, the Exodus is a nice story, and I appreciate that people think that this is a moment of liberation for them, and as well they should, but also remind yourselves that it ends with the slaughter of the Canaanites in the Promised Land.
hmm
And so when reading Joshua 5, there's this really curious bit where Joshua encounters the commander of Yahweh's army. And just random moment, he runs across this gentleman with a sword, and there's this back and forth. Who are you? Are you with our enemies or with us? And this commander, this angelic being in theory, says, neither. As the commander of Yahweh's army, I am here though.
hmm
I'm not with you. I'm not with them. And then Joshua kind of falls down at his feet and says, "What should I do?" And he says, "Take off your sandals." So, very for this is holy ground. In the same way that Moses in beginning of Exodus. And so this is there's a thread running through Joshua that I think many people make an argument about, which is that it can in some sense rehabilitate Joshua. That there are these two voices. Daniel Hawk makes this argument, I think, and parts of it I really like. That there are these two voices. One, this dominant militaristic conquest model. Like we're going to go in, roll over everyone else, take the land, we kill everyone, and it works. And then there's this other kind of subtle nuance. Well, things aren't quite like that. Can Israel actually deliver on the thing that it's supposed to do? So, like Rahab is saved in Joshua 2. The Gibeonites are saved in chapter 9. So you've got these snapshots of things that are complicating this militaristic narrative, but neither of those perspectives really ever deviate from the fact that God gave Israel the land to violently dispossess it from these people. Both of them are totally okay with that. And so I do a close reading of this text, and then I try to put it through the paces of this Canaanite reading, this reading with Canaanite eyes. So I turn to Subcomandante Marcos, who is the spokesperson for the EZLN, the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional. So in 94, there was this revolution in Mexico against the passing of the North American Free Trade Act.
hmm
And there were all these kind of statements produced by the army that did this as an indigenous army resisting the Mexican government's disregard for their livelihoods with this Free Trade Act. And in some ways, I think for those of us who don't regularly encounter indigenous communities face to face, I think it's incumbent upon us to, at the very least, read what they say. And so I turned to Subcomandante Marcos to try and understand, trying to think through how would he read this text? What would he see in it? Is there a way that reading this through Canaanite eyes could, in some sense, rehabilitate the text? And the conclusion is no.
hmm
That the Canaanite eyes actually point us towards the parts of the text that can't be ultimately redeemed. And so, rather than saying, "Let's just kick this text to the curb in some sense, I make the argument that that one has to read beyond the bounds of religious communities. So this is Brevard Child's the kind of canonical model assumes the church as the kind of central locus of the reading. But when the church and the empire are kind of the same, then what do you do?
Hmm.
And I think in some sense, what the move is I call the humanizing community, to move beyond the bounds of any particular religious community and to include in our imaginations indigenous communities, oppressed folks in general, specifically indigenous communities, though, who are on the receiving end of this kind of colonial violence of interpretation. Because books like Joshua essentially function to brutalize people in both American continents. I mean, this is the Spanish are using this, the British are using this, the Americans are using this. I mean, it all ends with the violent dispossession of indigenous communities. And so the pitch that I'm making through the piece is biblical interpreters of these passages have a responsibility to people who are outside their communities, and they need to imagine themselves in conversation with these people and ideally be in actual conversation with them, but at the very least keep them in their minds lest their interpretations just kind of reify this colonial violence.
Yeah, it was super interesting to me the way that you immediately addressed stolen land and the millions of indigenous lives affected in the past 5.5 centuries. Like you drew me right in by talking about that immediately in the piece and then bringing in, biblical scripture and examples and things like that from the
Mm-hmm.
Bible. Like it was a really amazing hook for somebody like me who, I care about history and
Yeah,
like the history of this
yeah.
continent and land in general. I think about the five nations that
Mm-hmm.
that Western New York sits on, like where I live,
Yeah.
often. So drawing me in with the stolen land right off the bat was a really powerful writing move for you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. I mean, it was a lot of it was I was working on this piece. I was teaching a class here at Reed called Bible, Race, and Empire, kind of talking about the function of biblical texts in westward expansion and American conceptions of racialization. And we spent a long time reading Joshua in light of these kind of texts from Manifest Destiny and indigenous authors talking about this interaction. And it was just right there for me. And the Pacific Northwest as well. I mean, we have this reputation for being this very progressive place, which in many ways we are. But the stories of indigenous dispossession in the Pacific Northwest are not told. If
Hmm.
you drive between Portland and Vancouver, British Columbia on Interstate 5, you pass countless indigenous reservations. And in my entire childhood, in public school here in Washington State, nobody ever mentioned why that was the case. So for me, part of it was the writing that I was doing, part of it was the teaching that I was doing, and part of it is the sense of honestly accountability, that I'm from this part of the world. It is my responsibility to know and to advocate for indigenous communities. And I just don't know how to do what I'm doing otherwise.
Yeah, and it like connects the arrival of the Israelites in Canaan to like a similar you say it really interestingly, a similar
Mm,
imagination to Mexico. And I
yeah.
really liked that phrasing too. I hadn't really thought about it like that.
I mean, it was a really disturbing realization to understand the conquistadores. I mean, they roll into Mexico with this sense of God wills it, right? That
Hmm.
and we will conquer you, and if you convert to Christianity, then well, I guess we'll enslave you and really horribly brutalize you and civilize you in quotes, right? But this is all justified by means of these texts. I mean, Joshua is one of the fundamental pieces of see, look, God gives God's people access to everything. And if people can become God's people, they can be saved. Look at Rahab. But if they don't, then we're fully within our means to kill them.
Yeah.
And this is and so I mean, this is literally the narrative of the biblical text, um, taking flesh and blood in Spanish conquest.
Yeah. It's like you're noticing, it's like you're in your work, it seems like you have this knack for picking up on patterns that occur like centuries apart, but have like similar ways that they kind of went down. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, thank you. I really appreciate that compliment. I mean, it was this is something that I want to think about. I think there is a conversation around biblical texts, which, helpfully distances us from the events and the production of these texts. I mean, thousands of years ago, it's important to deploy historical criticism for these purposes. But also, these texts are still live with us today, and they're still
Mm-hmm.
doing things throughout history, and especially once you get Christian empires using these texts, they become deployed for very nefarious means quite quickly, with uh, religious justification that can be taken straight off the page. I mean, for say the Holy Roman Empire, or the Spanish Empire, or the British Empire, in some senses, we're God's chosen community. And so, as God's chosen community, we exercise the rights of that community to uh, conquer everyone, and to make
Yeah.
them a part of God's chosen community, should they so choose. But if they choose badly or wrongly, well, then they just, the sword.
Yeah. Well, something else that I really am enjoying about your work, let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about some
Yeah,
public scholarship, bringing your work
yeah,
into the here and now, because, being a Pentateuch Hebrew Bible scholar, it might be kind of difficult to be like, how am I a part of like the conversation around
mm,
modernity if I'm working with scripture from antiquity? And then the ways that you are tying to like indigeneity and conquest and settler colonialism kind of gives it that modern entry
yeah,
point for a lot of issues to see how these issues that are described in these antiquity scriptures are still alive in front of us to this very day. And what I get the impression of is that you're interested in doing that. You're interested in getting your work out there in the public sphere a little bit. You're coming on this podcast to talk about it.
yeah,
So tell me a little bit about your work with Sacred Rights in that program that works with
yeah.
scholars to bring their work to a greater public audience.
I was very excited to be a part of Sacred Rights. I mean, the opportunity to really focus on taking our work as scholars that we do in our academic discourses and research and papers and conferences and so on and so forth into the mainstream was and is significantly important to me, because I think one of the problems that we have with biblical texts and their interpretation in general is that the portrayal of them in media often takes place through the most extreme voices. So CNN, what have you, or they'll bring in Mark Goodacre from Duke because he's a responsible person, and Candida Moss and a couple of other people who are like normal great scholars.
Mm-hmm.
But by and large, the imaginaries through which people think about biblical texts are steeped in evangelical fundamentalism,
Mm-hmm.
and that the Bible is in some sense magic,
Right.
and that magic can justify anything, and inherently to that kind of argument does justify whatever the United States government chooses to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, I don't know if you remember from 2020 of that picture of Donald Trump outside of that Episcopal church downtown DC holding a
Absolutely.
Bible. I
Like
mean,
it was
he
yesterday.
right, and he didn't even open it. He didn't read it. He could just hold it, and
Yeah.
it spoke volumes. I mean, if you go and look at the pictures from January 6th, I mean, they're like Bibles and crosses and all kinds of religious imagery. So, I mean, these things are in the groundwater. Like, and I think unless biblical scholars take very seriously that we know some things that people, ought to be talking about. I don't want to say need to know the way we know. That's not necessary per se, but I want them to talk about it. Like, maybe
Sure.
there's, maybe unnecessarily these texts do different things than people tend to think. So Sacred Rights gives me that space, that preparation to realistically engage. And as you can tell from my subject matter, I mean, the parallels with contemporary issues, especially in the Middle East, are practically one to one.
Mm-hmm.
And so, trying to tread that ground carefully as a person who uh, doesn't have tenure,
Mm-hmm.
and needs to be cautious, but also wants to give people tools to think about what the effects of biblical texts are, and what they could be doing, what should they be doing, is there a should there, and I would argue that there is at least a should not. They should not be doing certain things,
Mm-hmm.
because historically speaking they weren't, for a very long time. I mean, Jewish communities historically speaking don't have the engagement with the book of Joshua in the way Christian communities do, because the rabbis were like, well, Joshua's kind of a hack, he's not Moses, this burning bush moment that I mentioned. Moses takes off his sandals and God reaffirms Moses' leadership. That doesn't happen to Joshua. He just takes off his sandals and the story ends. So anyway, all this is to say, I think really giving folks the opportunity to think about the impact of these texts in the world that they live in, and specifically for a broader, more nuanced conversation around religion. Being from the Pacific Northwest, things tend to be kind of one or the other out here. So we've got secularists in some sense. I don't think they would call themselves that, but for sake of argument, secularists over here who are saying, well, we're not religious whatsoever, and you religious people are all kind of crazy. And you have like fundamentalists, evangelical fundamentalists on the other hand, who are like, well, you secularists are the worst people in the world, and I can't believe you think these things, and and many of us are just actually in between that space.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is that the poles are actually quite marginal. The real conversation is somewhere in between, and that social and society, in American society in particular, needs a healthy discussion around these things. Folks need to have the tools to analyze the ways in which biblical texts play into the construction of American identities, our kind of national histories. And I think if without sacred rights, I would not be in the position that I am to actually make a contribution. And the ongoing relationships that I have through the program with other scholars, with Liz Bucar and Brooke as well, but just being able to really send people a message and say, hey, I'm thinking about this. How do you think I should frame this? What kind of a pitch should I consider? I mean, just
Right.
to be in a community of people who are doing really committed, clever, ongoing, careful work about how do we be a part of these conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are some of your goals? What are you shooting for?
Well, so I mean, I tend to think of myself as a public intellectual.
Mm-hmm.
I obviously I want to publish books and things, and
Sure.
tenure. I like the scholarly conversations, and I'm very happy to give presentations and such. My hope is to be able to write some things that are like broadly appeal, that have broad appeal, that can kind of foreground some of these issues for people who are not specialists, who are not scholars. So I have a friend, Presbyterian minister in Atlanta, and she and I were talking, and she was saying, look, I can get the heavy hitting kind of academic books for my congregation, but they can't follow the arguments. Not that they're it's specialist arguments. Why would they? Or I can get them InterVarsity Press stuff that they can follow, but I have to do so much work to rehabilitate these texts that it's not even really worth. They're not even really worth buying them. And so I was like, oh, but I can thread that needle. I can give you something that your people could actually do something with, that they could then read. And I don't know that would solve the problems per se, but I think being on podcasts like this, or giving interviews, writing op-eds, explainers, being present in just kind of a broader sense of discourse about biblical texts in American society, I think is the goal. So I don't necessarily need to be the guy. I don't have those pretensions, but I'd like to be one of the people who people can think, oh, I want to know about this. I heard about this guy. I can look at his work, and whether or not they like it, that's not really the point. At least it's helping them, to have the conversation. I remember years ago, I was, much water has passed under the bridge since then. But I remember when Rob Bell, do you remember this book? Rob Bell put out this book on hell.
No, I don't.
So Rob Bell is a Christian theologian, minister guy. He wrote this very, not groundbreaking for many of us. Universalism has been a part of Christian theological constructions for a long time, but he kind of brought it into the evangelical sphere for the first time, that essentially hell is an unconvincing theological concept. Not a shock for many people, but for the evangelical communities, it was, somebody dropped 1,000-pound anvil on their steeple, and so I mean, to the extent that John Piper gets on Twitter at the time and goes, goodbye, Rob Bell. And so all of these, like this, like really conservative reformed theologian comes, and it just triggers this enormous explosion. Well, the result is everyone read Rob Bell's book.
Yeah.
And so he got to be a substantive contributor to the conversations. Now, I don't, that's not the sort of book I tend to, I would write, but, you roll out in a book, say, and you say, look at the way that the Bible inherently contributes to settler colonialism, you know, that's going to do something more or less analogous.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah, and I love the way you said that you're like, I don't necessarily need to be the guy, but I want to be like involved in the conversation. That's my main thing that I love so much about doing this
Mm,
show is that I've never once on this show presented myself as like an expert in any one of these fields. I'm a high school
mm,
teacher who teaches about religion. And so these conversations are a way for me to give all of you a platform, but also for me to continue to learn. Do you know what I mean?
yeah,
Like
absolutely.
that's what this project is for me is it is ongoing intellectual professional development, and that's what
Yeah.
this does for me as a platform is that I get to bring cool
Hmm.
people like you to the world and have your ideas kind of like get some light shown on them a little bit, and I also get to learn stuff, so that's like the best part about it.
I mean, this is how I feel about having like colleagues like yourself or other people through Sacred Rites is, I'm just immersed in this world of people who do spectacular work. Do you know Jorge Rodriguez?
Yes.
Jorge came and did a lecture for us at Reed.
Fabulous.
And my students their minds were blown. And
Yeah.
I was so pleased to be able to have this short list of people who I know I could invite and offer something substantive, something important, something that my students don't regularly experience. I mean, people like Jorge are not common,
Yeah.
and so uh, somebody with that level of education and embodied responsibility in his community.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just like anyway. So all this is to say, like that, I very similarly, I feel like I'm learning from all these colleagues through Sacred Rites and otherwise, and I think that I don't know, it makes me want to keep doing it.
I love it. Well, Dr. Chauncey Handy, where can people find you if they want to follow along with what you're doing, learn more, or just, can see where you go in the future with your work?
Yeah, I mean, so you can follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is, let me just, yeah, Chauncey DF Handy,
Okay.
or I suppose X now, but Twitter.
Sure.
And then, yeah, I mean, you can check out the Reed College Religion Department website and see the things that I'm working on and things that we have going on, both in Portland and otherwise. And for the moment, those are, I think, the best places for folks to look.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Chauncey Handy, thank you so much for joining me to talk about your article, Reading with Canaanite Eyes, Joshua 5 in the Gaze of the Indigenous Mexican Revolutionary, but also telling me about your dissertation, which I didn't get to dive into, but I learned a lot based on our little chunk of conversation
Mm,
we had called Mestizo Poetics of Belonging, Deuteronomy's Construction of Israelite Ethnicity. Loved learning from you and hearing about your projects because I love when I can have these connections from antiquity to the modern day kind of blend in a new way. So that's what you've done for me today. So I appreciate the opportunity to learn with you and have this conversation.
thank you so much, Greg. It was a real pleasure and grateful for the opportunity to share with you and your listeners.